In the bustling art quarter of Marrakech, where tourists haggle over mass-produced paintings and street vendors call out prices in broken English, one signature on a canvas would unravel 30 years of carefully buried lies. What started as a simple commission, a wealthy businessman wanting his portrait painted, would expose a family secret so profound that it would change two lives forever and force a man to confront the brother he thought had died decades ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the narrow alleyways of the Medina as Kwame Asante carefully arranged his easel outside the Café des Épices. His weathered hands, stained permanently with oils and charcoal, trembled slightly as he positioned his canvas, not from age, though he was 53, but from the constant undernourishment that had become his unwelcome companion over the past 2 years. Kwame had not always painted portraits for tourists. There was a time long ago when his name carried weight in the art circles of Accra, when gallery owners competed for his abstract pieces that seemed to capture the very soul of West African twilight. His paintings once hung in the homes of diplomats and the lobbies of five-star hotels from Lagos to Johannesburg. But that was before the gallery fire, before the insurance company refused to pay, before his reputation crumbled along with his financial stability. Now, in this ancient Moroccan city where he'd fled to escape his failures, Kwame survived on $20 portrait sketches and the occasional $50 oil painting for wealthy Europeans seeking authentic African art to hang in their Parisian apartments. The irony wasn't lost on him. A Ghanaian artist painting Moroccan street scenes for French collectors who would never set foot in either country. His setup was modest but professional. A portable easel his father had bought him 25 years ago, a wooden palette scarred by thousands of color mixings, and a collection of brushes that had seen better decades but still held their shape when coaxed with the right touch. His paints, bought in small tubes when he could afford them, were rationed like medicine. Ultramarine blue was reserved for skies and shadows, cadmium red for the occasional sunset commission, and titanium white, his most precious resource, for the highlights that brought life to otherwise ordinary faces. The morning crowd was thin. A few German tourists photographed everything but bought nothing. An elderly Moroccan man in a traditional jalaba sat nearby, sipping mint tea and watching Kwame work with the patient curiosity of someone who had nowhere else to be. The man had been there for 3 days now, always ordering the same tea, always sitting at the same table, always watching. Kwame had grown accustomed to observers. Some were potential customers, sizing up his skill before commissioning a piece. Others were fellow artists studying his technique. But this man felt different. His gaze carried a weight that made Kwame's neck prickle with unease. At precisely 10:30, a black Mercedes with tinted windows pulled up to the edge of the square, where cars were technically forbidden, but money often spoke louder than regulations. The driver, a stern-faced man in a crisp white shirt, emerged first and surveyed the area with the calculating eyes of security personnel. Then the rear door opened. Rashid Al-Zahrani stepped onto the cobblestones with the measured confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. At 45, he possessed the kind of presence that made conversations stop and heads turn, not because he was particularly tall or handsome, though he was both, but because wealth and power had a scent that people instinctively recognized. His suit, tailored in Milan, fit him like a second skin. His shoes, handcrafted in London, had never touched a surface they couldn't command respect from. He was the CEO of Al-Zahrani Holdings, a conglomerate that stretched across construction, telecommunications, and renewable energy throughout the Middle East and North Africa. His company had built half the luxury resorts along the Red Sea coast, supplied telecommunications infrastructure to 3 African nations, and was currently negotiating a $2 billion solar farm project with the Moroccan government. But Rashid hadn't come to the Medina for business. He had come because his wife Layla had insisted that their new penthouse in Casablanca needed something authentic, something with soul, for the main foyer. She had specifically requested a portrait, not a photograph, not a sculpture, but a painted portrait that would capture not just his appearance, but his essence. "You're always working," she had said over breakfast 3 weeks earlier, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I want something that shows who you are, when you're not being the CEO, when you're just..." Rashid. He had hired the best portrait artists in Casablanca first, then Rabat. The results had been technically perfect, but somehow hollow. Paintings that looked exactly like him, but captured nothing of substance. One artist had made him look too stern, another too soft. A third had somehow made him appear younger than his eldest son. Perhaps, his personal assistant had suggested, you need someone who paints from hunger rather than comfort. That suggestion had led him here, to the recommendation of a gallery owner who knew a gallery owner who knew a collector who had once bought a piece from a Ghanaian artist working the streets of Marrakech, poor as dirt, but with hands blessed by God himself. Kwame noticed the expensive shoes before he saw the face. In his years of painting tourists, he had learned to read people by their footwear. Scuffed sneakers meant budget-conscious students, designer sandals meant wealthy but casual spenders, and handcrafted leather shoes meant serious money with serious expectations. "Are you the artist?" Rashid asked in Arabic, his voice carrying the crisp accent of someone educated in London but raised in Riyadh. Kwame looked up, brush still poised above his palette. "I am," he replied in French, the common language of commerce in this part of the city. "I've been told you paint portraits." "I do." Rashid studied the canvas Kwame was working on, a half-finished street scene showing children playing football between parked motorcycles. The composition was dynamic, the colors rich despite their obvious economy. More importantly, there was something alive in the brushstrokes, an energy that the expensive portrait artists had somehow sanitized out of their work. "I want you to paint me," Rashid said without preamble. "A formal portrait, full torso, traditional. Pose, but I want it to look like a person, not a photograph." Kwame set down his brush. In the hierarchy of street art commissions, formal portraits were the summit. They paid well, took days rather than hours, and if executed properly, often led to referrals among wealthy social circles. "That would be possible," Kwame said carefully. "The price would depend on the size and timeline you require. Size is not a concern. Timeline is 3 weeks maximum. Price..." Rashid reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather wallet that probably cost more than Kwame earned in 6 months. "What do you typically charge?" This was the moment that separated professional artists from desperate ones. Quote too high and lose the commission entirely. Quote too low and signal that your work has no value. Kwame had learned this lesson the hard way during his first months on the street. For a formal portrait of that timeline, painted in oils on professional-grade canvas, the fee would be $800. It was more than he had ever charged for street work, but less than he used to command in his gallery days. A middle ground that reflected both his current circumstances and his undeniable skill. Rashid didn't blink. 1,000, but I wanted exceptional. He peeled off 5 $200 bills with the casual efficiency of someone buying coffee. "This is half now, half on completion. I want to see preliminary sketches in 3 days." Kwame stared at the money. It represented 2 months of rent, 3 months of food, and enough art supplies to work properly for the first time since arriving in Morocco. But more than that, it represented something he had almost forgotten: professional respect. "Where would you like the sittings to take place?" Kwame asked, his mind already racing through composition possibilities. My hotel has a private salon with excellent natural light, the La Mamunia. Do you know it? Kwame knew it by reputation, one of the most expensive hotels in North Africa, where princes and presidents stayed when visiting Marrakech. The kind of place where his street clothes would immediately mark him as someone who had entered through the wrong door. I'll need to bring my equipment. Arrangements will be made. My driver will collect you tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll discuss the specific requirements then. Rashid turned to leave, then paused. What's your name? Kwame Asante. Ghanaian? Yes. Something flickered across Rashid's face, too quick to interpret, too subtle to ignore. For just a moment, his composure wavered, as if the name had triggered a memory he wasn't expecting to confront. Tomorrow at 9, he repeated, but his voice had changed slightly, carrying a note of something that might have been recognition or might have been uncertainty. As the Mercedes pulled away, Kwame remained standing beside his easel, the 5 bills still clutched in his paint-stained fingers. The elderly Moroccan man at the café table was watching him with increased intensity now, his tea forgotten, his eyes sharp, with an interest that seemed suddenly personal rather than casual, but Kwame was too focused on the commission to notice. For the first time in 2 years, he would sleep without worrying about tomorrow's meals. For the first time since the gallery fire, he would paint with proper materials and unlimited time. For the first time since leaving Ghana, he felt like an artist again, rather than a desperate man with a brush. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the name Kwame Asante had just landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples were already beginning to spread in directions that would soon reshape everything he thought he knew about his own life. The elderly man at the café finally stood, left money on the table for his untouched tea, and walked away, with the purposeful stride of someone who had just witnessed something significant. His destination, a phone booth 3 blocks away where he would make a call that had been 30 years in the waiting. As the sun climbed higher and the morning shadows shortened, Kwame packed his equipment with the careful precision of someone who had learned to treat every brush and tube of paint as precious. Tomorrow would begin the most important commission of his career in Morocco. He had no idea it would also be the commission that would finally answer the question that had haunted him since childhood. What had really happened to his brother Omar, who had disappeared without explanation 3 decades ago, leaving behind only a letter saying he was going somewhere he could become someone new? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The La Mamunia Hotel rose from the heart of Marrakech like a palace from Arabian Nights, its rose-colored walls and towering minarets making even the surrounding luxury seem modest by comparison. As Rashid's driver navigated through the hotel's private entrance, Kwame pressed his face to the tinted window, watching fountains dance in mathematical precision and palm trees that had been manicured to architectural perfection. The art supplies he had purchased the previous evening sat, carefully arranged, in 2 canvas bags beside him, real sable brushes, genuine lapis lazuli blue, and a stretch of Belgian linen canvas that felt like silk beneath his fingers. For the first time in months, he had slept deeply, not because his problems had vanished, but because he remembered what it felt like to anticipate creating something beautiful. The driver, Ibrahim, had been surprisingly talkative during the 20-minute journey from Kwame's modest riad in the Medina. Unlike the stoic security presence from yesterday, Ibrahim seemed genuinely curious about art, mentioning that his daughter painted as a hobby and asking technical questions about color mixing that suggested more than casual interest. Mr. Al-Zarani is particular about his space, Ibrahim had warned as they approached the hotel. The salon where you'll work. It was his wife's favorite room. He's never allowed anyone else to use it for business. The weight of that information settled over Kwame like a responsibility. This wasn't just a commission, it was a tribute to someone whose absence clearly still shaped Rashid's world. The hotel's interior overwhelmed every sense: marble floors, inlaid with intricate geometric patterns, ceilings painted with gold leaf that caught and reflected light like trapped sunshine, and the lingering scent of orange blossoms and expensive perfume that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Guests moved through the lobby with the fluid grace of people who had never questioned their right to occupy beautiful spaces. Kwame's reflection in the polished marble showed a man who clearly didn't belong. His worn leather jacket, carefully mended at the elbows, his canvas pants that were clean but bore the permanent stains of his profession, his hands that no amount of scrubbing could completely free from the evidence of his work. Yet none of the staff looked at him with anything approaching disdain. Money, he realized, had preceded him and smoothed his path in ways that mere appearance never could. The elevator to the penthouse level was operated by a uniformed attendant who made polite conversation in perfect English about the weather and the quality of morning light. "Excellent for artistic work today, sir." The attention to detail was extraordinary. Someone had clearly prepared the entire staff for his arrival. The penthouse salon took Kwame's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced east, flooding the space with the kind of natural light that artists dream about, soft, consistent, and free from the harsh shadows that plague most indoor spaces. The room had been decorated with exquisite taste: Persian rugs that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, furniture that managed to be both authentic and comfortable, and walls lined with what appeared to be genuine antique paintings from across the Islamic world. But it was the easel positioned precisely in the center of the room that made Kwame's heart race. It wasn't just expensive. It was perfect, adjustable to any height or angle, with a sliding palette shelf and built-in lighting that could supplement the natural illumination if needed. Beside it, a table held an array of brushes, paints, and mediums that represented every tool a portrait artist could possibly need. "I thought you might prefer to work with familiar equipment," Rashid said from behind him. Kwame turned to find his patron had entered silently, dressed in a charcoal-grey suit that was somehow both formal and relaxed. In the hotel's magnificent setting, Rashid looked completely at home, not because of his wealth, but because he possessed that rare quality of someone who was comfortable with himself regardless of his surroundings. "This is extraordinary," Kwame managed, "but I brought my own supplies. Use whatever inspires you. I want the result to be yours, not limited by inadequate tools." Rashid settled into a leather chair positioned to catch the morning light at its most flattering angle. The pose was natural yet dignified, one arm resting on the chair's arm, his body turned slightly toward the artist, his expression open but thoughtful. "Tell me about your process," Rashid said as Kwame began arranging his materials with the ritualistic care of someone preparing for something sacred. "I prefer to begin with conversation rather than sketching," Kwame replied, selecting a charcoal pencil for preliminary studies. "Faces change when people talk about things that matter to them. I want to capture who you are, not just what you look like. What would you like to know?" Kwame studied his subject's face in the morning light, noting the way shadows fell across his cheekbones, the subtle lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who squinted frequently, perhaps from desert sun or the concentrated effort of reading contracts in multiple languages. "What drives you?" Kwame asked, beginning to sketch loose compositional lines on a pad. "Beyond business, beyond success. What gets you out of bed when you could afford to stay there forever?" Rashid was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the windows where the Atlas Mountains were visible in the distance. their peaks catching the morning light like beacons. Legacy, he said finally, but not the kind most people think about. I don't need buildings with my name on them or foundations that will outlast my grandchildren. I want to leave behind evidence that I understood something true about the world. The answer surprised Kwame. He had expected something more conventional: family, achievement, the satisfaction of building something from nothing. This was more philosophical, more personal. What kind of truth? That belonging isn't about where you're born or what language you dream in. It's about finding the place where your authentic self can exist without apology. Kwame's pencil paused mid-stroke. The words resonated with something deep in his own experience, the feeling of displacement that had followed him from Ghana to Morocco, the sense that he was always performing a version of himself rather than simply being himself. You sound like someone who has been searching for that place, Kwame observed. Haven't we all? Rashid's smile was rueful. I was born in Saudi Arabia, educated in England, built my career across Africa and the Middle East. My wife was Lebanese French. My children speak 4 languages fluently and consider themselves citizens of nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. We're a generation caught between traditions we're not sure we believe in and innovations we're not sure we understand. As Kwame sketched, something unexpected began to happen. The formal commission, wealthy businessman hiring street artist, began to transform into something more intimate. 2 men from different worlds discovering they shared the same fundamental questions about identity and belonging. Your wife, Kwame said carefully. Ibrahim mentioned this was her favorite room. Rashid's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Layla died 18 months ago. Cancer. She fought it for 3 years with the same determination she brought to everything else in her life. I'm sorry. She would have liked you, Rashid said. She had a theory that artists were the only people who told the truth consistently because they couldn't afford the luxury of lies. Kwame looked up from his sketching. What did she mean? She said that when you're creating something from nothing, you can't fake your way through it. Either you understand light and shadow and the way emotions change the shape of a face, or you don't. Either you can see what's really there, or you're just copying what you think should be there. The insight hit Kwame like a physical blow. It was exactly the distinction he had been struggling to articulate about his own work, the difference between painting what clients wanted to see and painting what was actually in front of him. She sounds like she understood artists better than most artists understand themselves. She understood people, all kinds of people. She could walk into a room full of strangers and within an hour know who was lonely, who was hiding something, who was genuinely happy. It was like she could see through all the performance to whatever was authentic underneath. Kwame began a more detailed sketch of Rashid's face, focusing on capturing the way grief had settled into the corners of his eyes without overwhelming his essential dignity. This was the challenge of portraiture, showing the accumulation of experience without reducing a person to their tragedies. What about you? Rashid asked suddenly. What brought you from Ghana to Morocco? The question was innocent enough, but it landed in territory that Kwame usually avoided in casual conversation. His story of professional decline and personal exile wasn't the kind of thing that inspired confidence in potential clients. Fire, he said simply. My gallery burned down 3 years ago. Insurance company refused to pay, claimed it was arson. My reputation was destroyed along with my artwork. Was it arson? Kwame met Rashid's gaze directly. No, but proving innocence is much harder than people imagine, especially when the evidence has turned to ash. So you came here to start over. I came here to disappear. Starting over was a more recent development. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Kwame's pencil capturing the essential structure of his subject's face, while his mind processed the unexpected depth of their conversation. This wasn't the typical dynamic of artist and patron. There was too much mutual curiosity, too much genuine interest in each other's perspectives. "May I ask you something personal?" Rashid said, as Kwame began mixing colors on his palette. Of course. Your name, Kwame Asante. Are those traditional Ghanaian names?" "Kwame means born on Saturday. Asante is the name of the ethnic group I belong to, in the Ashanti region. My parents weren't particularly traditional, but they wanted me to carry something of our heritage." Rashid nodded slowly, but his expression had changed in a way that Kwame couldn't quite interpret. There was something calculated about the casualness of his next question. "Do you have family still in Ghana?" "My parents died when I was young. I had a brother, but—" Kwame paused, surprised by how easily the words came. He rarely talked about Omar with strangers. "He disappeared when I was 23, left a note saying he was going to find a place where he could become someone new. I never heard from him again." The color drained from Rashid's face so completely that Kwame set down his brush in alarm. "Are you all right?" Rashid stood abruptly, walking to the window with jerky, uncontrolled movements that were completely at odds with his usual fluid composure. "What was your brother's name?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Omar Asante." "Why?" Rashid gripped the windowsill with both hands, his knuckles white against the dark wood. When he turned back to face Kwame, his eyes held a wild mixture of disbelief, recognition, and something that looked remarkably like fear. "Omar," he repeated, as if testing the name's weight on his tongue. "Omar who disappeared 30 years ago. Omar who wanted to become someone new." Kwame's world tilted sideways. "How do you know about my brother?" Rashid's laugh was sharp, almost hysterical. "Because Omar Asante didn't disappear, Kwame. He became someone new, exactly like he said he would." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic from the streets below. Kwame's mind raced through possibilities, rejecting each one as impossible even as the truth began to take shape in the space between them. "Omar Asante," Rashid continued, his voice gaining strength, "became Rashid al-Zahrani. Omar Asante is standing right here, looking at the brother he thought he'd never see again." The brush fell from Kwame's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the marble floor and leaving a small splatter of ultramarine blue, like a tiny wound in the perfect white stone. The silence stretched between them like a chasm 30 years in the making. Kwame stared at the man claiming to be his brother, searching for any trace of the 25-year-old who had vanished from their small apartment in Kumasi with nothing but a backpack and a promise to send word when he was safe. Omar had been taller than Kwame, with the same angular cheekbones but a more pronounced jaw. He had walked with a slight limp from a childhood accident, favored his left hand when writing, and had a habit of running his fingers through his hair when he was thinking deeply. This man, Rashid, showed none of those physical markers. Yet, something in his eyes, something in the way he held his shoulders when emotional, triggered a recognition so profound it made Kwame's chest ache. "Prove it," Kwame said finally, his voice hoarse. "If you're really Omar, prove it." Rashid moved to a mahogany desk positioned beneath one of the salon's smaller windows. From the bottom drawer, he withdrew a worn leather journal, its edges softened by years of handling. He opened it carefully, pages crackling with age, and removed a photograph that had been pressed between the leaves like a dried flower. The image was faded but unmistakable. Two young men standing outside the main library at the University of Ghana, arms slung around each other's shoulders, both grinning at the camera with the unconscious confidence of people who believed their futures were limitless. Kwame recognized his own face immediately. 23 years old, his hair longer than he wore it now, his eyes bright with the ambition that had driven him to apply for graduate programs in art history. But it was the other face that stopped. His breath. Omar, caught mid-laugh, his head tilted at the exact angle Rashid had held it moments earlier when discussing his wife. The resemblance was undeniable, but more than that, the photograph captured something that plastic surgery and time couldn't alter, the essential spirit of a person, the energy that animated their features. "You kept this," Kwame whispered, taking the photograph with trembling fingers. "I kept everything I could carry," Rashid replied. "Your letters, the drawings you made of our parents, the acceptance letter to that art program in London that you were too proud to accept because you thought it meant abandoning me." The last detail hit Kwame like a physical blow. He had never told anyone about the London program, never mentioned to friends or colleagues that he had turned down a full scholarship to the Royal College of Art because Omar was struggling with depression after their parents' deaths, and Kwame couldn't bear to leave him alone. "Why didn't you contact me?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. 30 years, Omar. 30 years of thinking you were dead, or worse, that you had chosen to erase me from your life. Rashid, Omar, sank into the leather chair he had been posing in just minutes earlier, but now his posture was entirely different. The confident businessman had disappeared, replaced by someone who looked profoundly tired, because I didn't just change my name, Kwame. I changed everything. My religion, my nationality, my entire identity. I became someone who could never go back to Ghana, never reclaim the life I had abandoned. But why? What happened that was so terrible you had to disappear completely? Omar closed his eyes, and when he opened them, Kwame saw something he remembered from their childhood. The look Omar got when he was about to confess to breaking something valuable. "Do you remember Kofi Mensah?" The name hit Kwame like cold water. Kofi Mensah had been a local businessman in Kumasi, someone who loaned money to young entrepreneurs at rates that seemed reasonable until the compound interest began its merciless climb. Omar had borrowed from him to start a small electronics repair business that had failed within 6 months. Of course, I remember him. You owed him money. I owed him 12,000 cedis at 18% monthly interest. By the time I realized I couldn't pay it back, the debt had grown to almost 30,000. Kwame felt his stomach drop. In 1994, that amount of money represented more than most families earned in 2 years. "He gave me a choice," Omar continued. "Work for him until the debt was paid, or he would make sure that both of us paid in other ways. He was very specific about what those other ways would involve. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke. Kofi Mensah's reputation for violence was legendary in their neighborhood. People who crossed him had a tendency to disappear or turn up in hospitals with injuries that would never fully heal. "So you ran?" "I ran. But first I went to his office one night to try to reason with him, to negotiate some kind of payment plan. I found him there alone, counting money from his safe. We argued. He pulled a knife. We fought." Omar's hands were shaking now, and Kwame noticed for the first time that his brother's left pinky finger was missing the top joint, a detail that had been hidden by the way he held his hands. "I didn't mean to kill him, Kwame." The knife turned in the struggle, and suddenly he was on the floor, bleeding, and I couldn't stop it. I tried to help him, but it was too late. The revelation settled over Kwame like a weight he couldn't lift. His brother, the man he had searched for, worried about, mourned for 30 years, was a killer. Not a murderer in the premeditated sense, but someone whose life had been shaped by a single moment of violence that had cascaded into 3 decades of necessary lies. "The money from his safe," Omar continued. "I took it. Not because I wanted to steal, but because I knew I had maybe hours before someone found the body. I needed resources to disappear completely, and that money was the difference between hiding in Ghana and escaping to somewhere I could start over. How much? Enough to buy passage to Morocco, false papers, and a new identity. Enough to survive for 6 months while I learned Arabic and invented a background that would stand up to casual scrutiny. Kwame tried to process the enormity of what his brother was telling him. But you didn't just survive. You became one of the wealthiest men in North Africa. How? For the first time since beginning his confession, Omar's expression showed a trace of the confidence Kwame had observed in Rashid al-Zahrani. I was always good with numbers, you remember that. And I understood something about human nature that most people miss. Everyone wants to believe they're getting a deal, especially when money is involved. I started small, buying and selling goods between Morocco and the Gulf states, finding inefficiencies in supply chains that I could exploit. That's not enough to build a fortune. No, it's not. But it's enough to build credibility. And credibility, properly leveraged, can become capital. Capital can become influence. Influence can become power. Power can become anything you want it to become. Omar stood and walked to one of the windows, gazing out at the Atlas Mountains that formed a distant backdrop to the city. I became Rashid al-Zahrani because Omar Asante was a liability, a man with no connections, no family, no social standing in a culture that values all three above almost everything else. But Rashid al-Zahrani was a blank slate. I could write whatever story served my purposes. What story did you write? That I was the son of a Saudi businessman who had died in a car accident, leaving me a modest inheritance that I was determined to multiply through my own efforts. I spoke enough Arabic to be credible, had enough money to look legitimate, and was hungry enough to work harder than anyone else in any room I entered. Kwame felt a strange mixture of admiration and revulsion. The ingenuity required to reinvent oneself so completely was staggering, but the foundation of that reinvention was built on violence and deception. And no one ever questioned your background. Money has a way of making questions disappear. By the time I was successful enough to attract real scrutiny, I was also powerful enough to ensure that any investigation would be conducted by people who had reasons to find exactly what I wanted them to find. What about Layla? Did she know? Omar's composure cracked slightly. Layla knew that Rashid al-Zahrani was not entirely who he claimed to be, but she thought the deception was about business dealings, maybe some tax avoidance or regulatory shortcuts. She never suspected that her husband was fundamentally a fiction. Did you love her? The question seemed to surprise Omar. More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. She made me want to be the man she believed I was, rather than the man I actually am. And now she's gone, and you're alone with the truth. Now she's gone, and I'm alone with everything I can never take back, and everyone I can never make amends to. Kwame picked up the photograph again, studying the faces of two young men who had believed they understood what their lives would become. Neither of them could have imagined this conversation, this room, this impossible collision of past and present. The old man, Kwame said suddenly, at the cafe where you found me, he was watching me for days before you arrived. Omar nodded grimly. Youssef. He's been with me for 15 years. Handled security and other sensitive matters. I sent him to observe you after I heard your name from the gallery owner. You've known who I was from the beginning. I suspected, but I needed to be certain, and I needed to understand what kind of man you had become before I decided whether to reveal myself. What kind of man did you decide I was? Omar turned from the window, meeting Kwame's gaze directly. The same kind you always were, someone who tells the truth even when it costs him everything, someone who creates beauty even when the world seems determined to destroy it, someone who would still drop everything to help his brother, even after that brother had abandoned him for 30 years. The words hung between them, an invitation and a challenge. Kwame felt the weight of the decision forming in his mind. He could walk away from this revelation, return to his simple life of street portraits and tourist commissions, pretend this conversation had never happened. Or he could step into the complicated reality of loving someone whose choices had been shaped by circumstances he couldn't fully understand. "What happens now?" Kwame asked. "That depends," Omar replied, "on whether you can forgive someone who has been lying about who he is for longer than he told the truth." Outside the salon's windows, the morning light was shifting toward afternoon, casting different shadows across the room, where two brothers stood facing each other across a chasm of years, secrets, and choices that could never be undone. The portrait, forgotten on its easel, remained unfinished, rough sketches and color studies that captured nothing of the complexity of the man who had commissioned it, or the artist who had discovered that some truths are too large to fit on any canvas. The decision to continue the portrait sessions came from an unexpected source. Neither brother suggested it, but both understood that abandoning the commission would mean abandoning any chance of rebuilding their relationship. Art which had brought them together would either heal the wounds of 30 years or expose them as too deep to bridge. 3 days passed before they spoke again. Omar had retreated to his business obligations, leaving Kwame alone in the hotel salon with his thoughts and a half-finished canvas that seemed to mock him with its incomplete vision. How do you paint someone when you've just learned that everything you thought you knew about their face was wrong? When Omar returned, he brought with him a leather briefcase and an expression that Kwame recognized from their childhood, the look Omar wore when he was about to propose something risky. "I've been thinking about what you said," Omar began, settling into the pose, but with a different energy than before. "About proof, about who I really am. Kwame selected a smaller brush, one better suited for detail work around the eyes. And I want to show you something. But first, I need to know, can you paint while we talk? Not just listen, but actually work. I've been painting portraits for 15 years. Some of my best work happened during difficult conversations." Omar opened the briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. "These are the records I've kept. Not the official ones that create Rashid al-Zahrani's biography, but the real ones. Bank transfers, travel documents, correspondence, everything that proves the story I told you yesterday." Kwame's brush paused halfway to the canvas. "Why would you keep evidence of what you've done?" "Because I never stopped believing that someday I might need to prove who I was to the one person whose opinion mattered more than my safety." The folder contained a chronicle of transformation that was both methodical and desperate, receipts for Arabic language lessons in Casablanca, documentation of the slow process of building a false identity, first a Moroccan residence permit, then business licenses, then the gradual accumulation of references and relationships that would support a more ambitious persona. Most unsettling were the photographs. Omar, at various stages of his metamorphosis, his appearance gradually shifting as he learned to dress, speak, and carry himself like someone born to wealth and authority. The progression was documented with the precision of someone who understood that a single inconsistency could unravel everything. "The plastic surgery was minimal," Omar said, noticing Kwame's focus on the images. "Just enough to age my face differently, to change the way shadows fell across my cheekbones. The real transformation was psychological." "How do you mean?" "I studied wealthy men the way other people study textbooks. I watched how they moved, how they spoke, how they made decisions. I learned that confidence isn't about believing you're better than other people. It's about believing you deserve to be wherever you are." Kwame began working on the portrait's background, using broad strokes to establish the play of light across the salon's windows. Painting helped him process information, gave his hands something to do, while his mind struggled with concepts too large for immediate understanding. "There's something else," Omar said, his voice taking on a quality that made Kwame look up from his work. From the folder, Omar withdrew a bundle of letters held together with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting faded but still legible. "I wrote to you," Omar said simply. "Every month for the first 5 years, then every few months after that. I never sent them, but I wrote them." Kwame set down his brush with hands that were suddenly unsteady. "What did you say?" "Everything I couldn't tell you in person. How much I missed you. How sorry I was for leaving without explanation. How proud I was when I heard through old friends that you had become successful as an artist. You kept track of me. I hired private investigators every few years, just to make sure you were safe, that you were building the life you deserved. When I learned about the gallery fire, about the insurance problems..." Omar's voice trailed off. "What about them?" "I wanted to help. I had connections, resources that could have made your problems disappear. But I knew that any assistance would require explaining who I was and how I could afford such help." The revelation hit Kwame like a slap. All those months of struggling to rebuild his reputation, of fighting insurance companies and lawyers with inadequate resources, while his brother possessed the power to solve everything with a few phone calls. "So you watched me lose everything and did nothing. I watched you lose everything and chose to preserve my secret instead of helping my brother." Yes, the brutal honesty was almost worse than a lie would have been. Kwame turned back to the canvas, using the physical act of painting to channel emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Anger, grief, and a profound sense of betrayal competed for dominance in his chest. "Read one," Omar said quietly. "What?" "Read one of the letters. Pick any one. You need to understand what it cost me to stay silent." Kwame selected a letter from the middle of the bundle, dated 6 years earlier. Omar's handwriting had evolved over the decades, becoming more controlled and formal, but the words themselves carried a rawness that no amount of practice could disguise. "My dear brother, today I saw a young artist in the Medina of Fez whose technique reminded me of your early work. Bold strokes that somehow captured more emotion than photographic realism ever could. I wanted to approach him, to mention that I had a brother who painted with similar passion, but of course I could not. Layla asked me again yesterday about my family. She has begun to suspect that my stories about being an only child are inconsistent with other things I have revealed about my childhood. I find myself wanting to tell her about you, about the way you used to paint our parents' portraits from memory after they died, about how you sacrificed your own dreams to take care of me when I was falling apart. But telling Layla about you would mean telling her about Omar, and Omar cannot exist in Rashid's world. The foundations of my life would crumble if anyone discovered that the man they know is built on the grave of another man's choices. Sometimes I wonder if the success I have achieved is worth the isolation it requires. I have wealth, influence, respect, but I cannot share any of it with the person whose opinion matters most to me. I have become exactly what I set out to become, and it feels like the cruelest joke imaginable. I hope you are well, brother. I hope you are painting beautiful things and finding peace in the work that always made you complete. Your brother, who misses you more than words can express. Omar Kwame finished reading and set the letter down with careful deliberation. The emotions it contained, loneliness, regret, love, were genuine, but they only made Omar's choices more incomprehensible. You could have contacted me, Kwame said, returning to his painting with movements that were more aggressive than artistic. Secret or no secret, you could have found a way. Could I? What would I have said? Hello, Kwame, I'm alive, but I've spent 30 years lying about who I am, and by the way, I killed a man to finance my new life. How exactly does that conversation go? Honestly, that conversation goes honestly. Omar was quiet for a long moment, his expression shifting in ways that the emerging portrait was beginning to capture. the subtle interplay between the confident businessman and the guilt-ridden brother who lived beneath that carefully constructed surface. "There's something else you need to know," Omar said finally, "about why I commissioned this portrait." Kwame looked up, noting something new in his brother's tone, a quality that suggested they had not yet reached the bottom of the secrets between them. "I'm dying, Kwame." The brush slipped from Kwame's fingers, leaving a streak of raw umber across the palette like a wound. "What?" "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors give me 6 months, perhaps 8 if I respond well to treatment." The salon's perfect light suddenly seemed harsh, artificial. Kwame gripped the edge of the easel to steady himself, his mind reeling from this latest revelation. "How long have you known?" 3 months. Long enough to understand that all the wealth and power in the world cannot buy the one thing I actually need, which is time. Time to make amends. Time to tell the truth. Time to be Omar Asante again before Omar Asante dies for real. Kwame sank into a nearby chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. "That's why you hired me, not because you needed a portrait, but because you recognized my name. I've been looking for you for 2 years, ever since the diagnosis, but I never had the courage to approach you directly. When I heard you were working in Marrakech, it felt like fate was offering me one last chance to do something right. The portrait isn't for your penthouse. The portrait is for you. Something to remember me by that isn't built on lies." The weight of this revelation settled over Kwame like a shroud. His brother had returned to him only to prepare him for losing him again, permanently this time. "Does anyone else know about the cancer? My doctors, my lawyer for estate planning purposes, and now you. What about your children, your business partners?" Omar's laugh was bitter. "My children know Rashid al-Zahrani, a successful businessman who provides for them generously, but has never been entirely present in their lives. My business partners know a reliable source of profit and strategic thinking. None of them know Omar Asante, the man who is actually dying." Kwame stared at the unfinished portrait, seeing it now for what it truly was. Not a commissioned artwork, but a final gift from a brother who had spent 30 years learning that some distances cannot be crossed without destroying the very thing you're trying to reach. "I don't know how to forgive you," Kwame said quietly, "but I don't know how to lose you again either." "Then don't choose," Omar replied. "Just paint. Paint me as I am now, not as I was or as I pretended to be. Paint the truth, and let that be enough." Outside the salon windows, clouds were gathering over the Atlas Mountains, promising rain that would wash the city clean for a few hours before the dust and heat returned. Inside, 2 brothers sat in the complicated silence of love that had survived betrayal, but wasn't sure it could survive honesty. The portrait waited on its easel, half-finished and entirely uncertain of how its story would end. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Kwame's modest riad in the Medina. Youssef, the security man who had been watching him at the café, stood at his door, holding a sealed envelope and wearing an expression that suggested the message inside was not routine business correspondence. "Mr. al-Zahrani asked me to deliver this personally," Youssef said in accented English, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone who had learned discretion as a survival skill. Kwame accepted the envelope, noting the quality of the paper and the fact that it bore no return address or identifying marks, the correspondence of someone who had learned to communicate important matters without leaving evidence. Inside, written in Omar's now familiar handwriting, was a single page. "Kwame, I need to show you something that cannot be discussed in the hotel. Meet me at the Majorelle Gardens at 3 o'clock. Come alone, and tell no one where you are going. There are aspects of my life, of Rashid's life, that you must understand before you decide whether the man I have become deserves the forgiveness you might offer the brother you remember." The gardens are where Layla and I went when we needed to speak about difficult things. It seems appropriate that they should witness this conversation as well, Omar. The Majorel Gardens were a 20-minute walk from Kwame's riad, through the bustling souks, where vendors called out prices in Arabic and French, past the snake charmers and henna artists who performed for tourists with cameras and locals who had seen the same shows 1,000 times. The contrast between the chaotic energy of the market streets and the serene beauty of the botanical gardens was jarring, like stepping from one world into another entirely. Omar was waiting near the memorial to Jacques Majorel, the French painter who had created this oasis of blue walls and exotic plants in the 1920s. He wore casual clothes, khaki pants and a linen shirt, but somehow managed to look more formal than most people did in business suits. Wealth, Kwame was learning, was as much about bearing as it was about possessions. "Thank you for coming," Omar said, falling into step beside Kwame as they walked deeper into the gardens. "I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. But curiosity has always been my weakness." They walked in silence for several minutes, past carefully maintained beds of cactus and palm trees, fountains that sparkled in the afternoon sun, and the famous blue villa that now housed a museum dedicated to Berber culture. The gardens were populated but not crowded, couples walking hand in hand, families with children who ran between the pathways, artists sketching in quiet corners. "Layla loved this place," Omar said, as they settled onto a bench positioned to overlook one of the larger water features. She said it reminded her that beauty could be created anywhere, even in the desert, if someone cared enough to tend it. Improperly. "What did you want to show me?" Omar reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a smartphone, not the latest model, but sleek and expensive nonetheless. He scrolled through the contacts until he found the name he was looking for, then handed the device to Kwame. The contact was labeled simply Kofi Jr. with a phone number that carried a Ghanaian country code. "Call him," Omar said. "Who is he?" "Kofi Mensah's son. He took over his father's business after what happened." Kwame stared at the phone, his mind racing through implications he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. "Why would I call him?" "Because for 30 years I've been sending him money. Not just the amount I took from his father's safe, but interest calculated at the same rate his father charged his borrowers, 22% annually, compounded monthly. The mathematics of that arrangement were staggering. What had started as perhaps 15,000 cedis would have grown to millions over 3 decades. "How much have you paid him?" $2.7 million, as of last month. Kwame nearly dropped the phone. "That's impossible. No debt could grow to that size. It's not about the debt anymore, it's about the guilt. And it's about making sure that Kofi Mensah's family never suffered because of what I did." "But why haven't you contacted them directly? Why haven't you told them the truth about what happened?" Omar's smile was rueful. "Because some truths are more dangerous than lies. If Kofi Jr. knew that his father's killer was alive and prosperous, he might decide that money isn't sufficient compensation." Kwame scrolled through the phone's message history, finding dozens of bank transfer confirmations, each one representing a substantial sum sent to accounts in Ghana. The most recent transfer, dated just a week earlier, was for $50,000. Does he know where the money comes from? He believes it comes from an investment fund his father established before his death. A fund managed by a Saudi businessman who prefers to remain anonymous. Another lie built on the foundation of the first lie. Yes, but a lie that has provided his family with education, healthcare, business opportunities, and financial security they never would have had otherwise. Kwame pressed the call button before he could reconsider. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered in accented English. "Good afternoon. This is Kofi Mensah Jr. Mr. Mensah, my name is Kwame Asante. I'm calling from Morocco regarding..." The investment fund that has been supporting your family. There was a pause, followed by the sound of papers rustling. I'm sorry, I don't understand. The fund is managed entirely through electronic transfers. We've never had direct contact with anyone associated with it. I know this is unusual, but I'm calling on behalf of the person who established the fund. He wanted me to ask you about your family's current situation, whether there are any needs that aren't being met. This is very unexpected. May I ask why this conversation is happening now? Kwame looked at Omar, who nodded encouragingly. The person who established the fund is seriously ill. He wanted to ensure that the arrangements he's made will continue to serve your family appropriately. I see. Well, please tell him that our family is deeply grateful. The fund has allowed me to complete university in England, to establish a successful import business, and to provide excellent educations for my children. My mother, who never recovered fully from my father's death, has been able to receive private medical care that has extended her life significantly. Kwame felt something catch in his throat. Your father's death was difficult for your family? Devastating. He was murdered during a robbery at his office. The police never found the killer, never recovered the money that was stolen. We lost everything overnight. Our savings, our home, our sense of security. Without the investment fund, I don't know how we would have survived. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Kofi Jr. describing the ways the mysterious fund had transformed his family's prospects. When Kwame finally ended the call, he found himself looking at his brother with a mixture of admiration and confusion. You gave them back more than you took, Kwame said. I gave them back what they would have had if I hadn't destroyed their father's life. But you also gave them opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Kofi Jr. studied in England, built a successful business. His family is better off than they would have been if you had never existed. Omar stood and walked to the edge of the fountain, staring into the water as if it might contain answers to questions he had been asking himself for decades. Does that matter? Does the outcome justify the means, or does the fact that I killed a man make everything that followed invalid? It was the central moral question that had haunted Omar for 30 years, and Kwame realized that his brother was asking him to serve as both judge and jury for a life built on violence and restitution. I don't know, Kwame said honestly, but I know that the man who has been paying that family for 30 years is not the same man who killed their father in a moment of panic and desperation. Isn't he? Haven't I been paying them precisely because I am that man? You've been paying them because you became someone who understood that actions have consequences that extend far beyond the original moment. That's not the same thing. They sat in silence for a while, watching tourists photograph the exotic plants and local children chase each other around the pathways. The gardens felt like neutral ground, beautiful enough to make difficult conversations possible, public enough to prevent emotions from overwhelming reason. There's one more thing, Omar said eventually, about the portrait. What about it? I want to change the composition. Instead of painting just me, I want you to paint both of us, brothers, together, the way we should have been all these years. Kwame considered the suggestion. From an artistic perspective, it would be challenging. Two figures required a completely different approach to lighting, composition, and emotional balance. From a personal perspective, it felt like an invitation to step into the frame of Omar's life, to become part of the story rather than just its chronicler. That would mean starting over completely, Kwame said. I know. It would also mean that the portrait becomes as much about me as it is about you. I know that too, and it would mean that anyone who sees it would know we're connected, that Rashid Al-Zahrani has a relationship with an unknown Ghanaian artist. Omar turned to face him directly. Which brings us to the real question, doesn't it? Are you willing to be connected to me publicly, knowing everything you now know about who I am and what I've done? The question hung between them like a bridge that could either connect their separate worlds or collapse under the weight of too much truth. Kwame understood that his answer would determine not just the future of their relationship, but the final months of his brother's life. In the distance, the call to afternoon prayers echoed across the city, a reminder that some things endure regardless of human plans and complications. The gardens continued their patient work of growing beautiful things in unlikely places, and two brothers sat contemplating whether love could survive the complete absence of innocence. "Yes," Kwame said finally. "Paint us together. Let the portrait. Tell the truth, whatever the consequences." Omar's smile was the first genuinely happy expression Kwame had seen on his face since the revelations began. "Then we start tomorrow," Omar said. "And this time we paint the story exactly as it is." The decision to start over proved more complicated than either brother had anticipated. When Kwame arrived at the hotel salon the following morning, he found Omar standing before the original portrait with an expression that bordered on reverence. The single-figure composition, though unfinished, had captured something essential about the man who called himself Rashid al-Zahrani. The weight of accumulated secrets, the careful composure that masked deeper vulnerabilities, the eyes that seemed to be looking at something just beyond the viewer's understanding. "It's good work," Omar said without turning around. "Better than I expected. It's incomplete. So are most important things." Kwame set down his supplies and studied the painting with the critical eye of someone who had learned to see his own work objectively. The brushwork was confident, the color relationships sophisticated, the psychological penetration more acute than anything he had produced in months. Destroying it to start over felt like vandalism. "We don't have to abandon this completely," Kwame said. "I could finish it first, as we originally planned, then create the dual portrait as a separate piece." Omar shook his head. "No, if we're going to do this, we do it right. One painting, two brothers, the truth about who we are together." "That's not how commissions usually work. This stopped being a commission the moment you learned my real name." As Kwame began preparing a new, larger canvas, Omar settled into a chair positioned to catch the morning light. But instead of adopting the formal pose they had been developing, he remained relaxed, almost casual. A man waiting for his brother rather than a CEO posing for posterity. "Tell me about the gallery fire," Omar said unexpectedly. Kwame paused. "In his preparation. Why?" "Because I need to understand what my choices cost you, all of them, not just the obvious ones." The question opened wounds that had never fully healed. Kwame had told the basic facts to Omar earlier, but he had not described the emotional devastation that had accompanied the practical losses. "It wasn't just the paintings that burned," Kwame began, mixing base colors on his palette with movements that were more therapeutic than artistic. "It was 15 years of connections, relationships, trust. People in the art world assumed that anyone who had mysteriously benefited from an insurance fire was probably complicit in causing it, even though the investigation cleared you. Especially because the investigation cleared me. In Ghana, when someone poor suddenly has a reason to collect insurance money and then gets cleared by police, people assume money changed hands rather than justice being served." Omar winced. "I remember how corruption worked there. Innocence wasn't as valuable as the right connections." "Exactly. So I became toxic to collectors, galleries, even other artists. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone who carried that kind of suspicion." Kwame began sketching the basic composition for the dual portrait, working out the spatial relationships between two figures of similar height and build. The technical challenges were significant. Two faces meant twice as many opportunities for psychological inconsistency, and the lighting would need to be balanced to serve both subjects equally. "What about rebuilding somewhere else? You had talent, reputation before the fire." I tried. Spent 6 months in Lagos, another 6 in Johannesburg. But the art world is smaller than people think, especially for African artists trying to establish themselves internationally. The story followed me. So you came to Morocco. I came to Morocco to disappear, just like you did. The difference is that you disappeared into a new identity that made you more powerful than before. I disappeared into anonymity that made me irrelevant. The parallel struck both men simultaneously. They had fled the same country for different reasons, but both had chosen exile over fighting to rebuild their reputations at home. "Do you ever think about going back?" Omar asked. "Every day. But going back means admitting that I failed, that I let circumstances defeat me instead of overcoming them. Or it means accepting that some battles can't be won and choosing to fight different ones." Kwame looked up from his sketching. "Is that what you're doing now? Fighting different battles?" "I'm trying to figure out what it means to die as Omar Asante instead of as Rashid al-Zahrani." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. It was one thing to reveal the truth to his brother, another entirely to consider what a public revelation might mean for the empire he had built, the people who depended on him, the carefully constructed life that would collapse if its foundations were exposed. "You're thinking about going public with your real identity," Kwame said. "It wasn't a question. I'm thinking about a lot of things, most of them probably stupid. Tell me." Omar stood and walked to the windows, gazing out at the Atlas Mountains that formed a constant backdrop to their conversations. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been wrestling with impossible decisions in solitude. Rashid al-Zahrani's estate is worth approximately $400 million. His business interests employ over 2,000 people across 6 countries. His charitable foundation provides medical care for orphans in 3 African nations and educational scholarships for 500 students annually. That's impressive. It's also built on a lie. Every contract signed by Rashid al-Zahrani, every legal document bearing his signature, every relationship built on his supposed background, all of it becomes questionable if the truth about Omar Asante comes to light. Kwame began working on the underpainting, establishing the basic color relationships and tonal structure that would support the more detailed work to come. The rhythmic motion of the brush helped him process the complexity of what his brother was contemplating. "But if you die as Rashid al-Zahrani," Kwame said, "then Omar Asante disappears forever. Your children inherit a legacy from a man who never really existed." "Exactly. They get the benefits of their father's success, but they never get to know who their father actually was." "What do they know about your background now?" "That their father was the son of a Saudi businessman who died young, leaving a modest inheritance. That Rashid multiplied through hard work and smart investments. They know he met their Lebanese-French mother in business school, married her after a long courtship, and built a life focused on family and responsible commerce. All lies. All lies that created the framework for genuine love, real relationships, and meaningful accomplishments." The moral complexity was dizzying. Omar's children had been raised by a loving father whose entire personal history was fiction, supported by wealth generated through enterprises built on a false identity, guided by values that were authentic, even if the man expressing them was technically an invention. "Have you considered telling just them? Keeping it within the family?" "Every day. But secrets have a way of spreading, especially secrets that could destroy hundreds of millions of dollars in business relationships. And my children, they're not equipped to carry that kind of weight." Kwame had been working while they talked, and the basic composition was beginning to emerge. 2 men of similar age and build, seated at slight angles to each other, their faces turned toward the viewer, but their bodies suggesting conversation, connection, shared understanding. It was more intimate than the formal portrait Omar had originally commissioned, more honest about the relationship between artist and subject. "There's another option," Kwame said carefully, "which is you let the portrait tell the story. Not explicitly, not in a way that would immediately expose everything, but in a way that leaves a record of the truth for people who matter to understand when they're ready." Omar returned to his chair, studying the emerging composition. How would that work? Art has its own language. People who know how to read paintings can see relationships, emotions, histories that aren't immediately obvious to casual viewers. If we paint this portrait thoughtfully, it can serve as both a public artwork and a private confession. And where would such a portrait be displayed? That would be up to you. But I imagine it could hang somewhere in your home where your children could see it daily, without necessarily understanding its full significance until they're mature enough to ask the right questions. Omar was quiet for a long time, his expression cycling through considerations that Kwame could only guess at. The weight of the decision was enormous, not just for Omar personally, but for everyone whose lives were connected to the empire he had built. "There's something I haven't told you," Omar said eventually, "about why this matters so much to me now." "What?" Layla figured it out. Not everything, but enough. In the months before she died, she started asking questions that were too specific to be casual curiosity. She knew that Rashid al-Zahrani's official biography didn't account for all of his knowledge, his instincts, his emotional responses to certain situations. Kwame's brush stilled. "Did you tell her the truth?" "I was going to. I had planned a conversation, chosen the time and place, prepared myself to lose everything I had built with her rather than continue lying. But she died before I could find the courage. So she died thinking her husband was hiding something from her but not knowing what. She died knowing that the man she loved was not entirely who he claimed to be, but trusting that whoever he really was, he was someone worth loving." The tragedy of that incomplete honesty settled over the salon like a weight. Layla had offered her husband the gift of unconditional acceptance, but he had been too afraid to accept it. "I don't want to make the same mistake with my children," Omar continued, "or with you. I want to die as someone who told the truth to the people who mattered, even if I couldn't tell it to the world." Kwame studied his brother's face, seeing there the expression he wanted to capture in the portrait, not the confident businessman or the guilt-ridden fugitive, but the man who was finally ready to be known completely by the people he loved. Then, "We paint the truth," Kwame said, "all of it, and we let the people who love us decide what to do with it." Omar nodded, settling back into the pose that would define the final weeks of their relationship and perhaps the legacy he would leave behind. Outside the salon windows, the morning light was beginning its slow progression toward afternoon, casting ever-changing shadows that would require constant adjustment of technique and vision. But for the first time since beginning this impossible commission, Kwame felt that he understood exactly what he was trying to create. Not just a portrait, but a testament to the possibility that love could survive the complete absence of pretense. 2 weeks into the dual portrait, Kwame made a discovery that would change everything. He was working on the final details of the background, subtle architectural elements that suggested both the luxury of the hotel salon and the earthier textures of their shared Ghanaian heritage, when his brush caught on something unexpected. In the paint layer, Omar had stepped away for a phone call with his business managers, leaving Kwame alone with the nearly completed work. The portrait had evolved into something extraordinary. Two men who were clearly brothers, seated in comfortable proximity, their faces reflecting both individual character and shared history. Omar's expression captured the weight of his accumulated secrets alongside the relief of finally sharing them. Kwame's own face showed the complex emotions of someone who had found something precious that he had thought was lost forever. But it was while adding the final touches to the background that Kwame felt his brush encounter resistance, a slight texture in the paint that shouldn't have been there. He paused, examining the area more closely, and realized that something was embedded beneath the surface layer. Using a palette knife with surgical precision, he carefully lifted away the fresh paint to reveal what lay beneath. Letters and numbers, inscribed directly onto the canvas in a hand he didn't recognize. The markings were faint but deliberate, as if someone had used a stylus to press the information into the fabric before any paint had been applied. The inscription read, Estate File 7429B, Safety Deposit Box 891, First National Bank, Casablanca. Keyholder, Youssef Ben Ali. Kwame stared at the hidden message, his mind racing through implications. Someone had deliberately embedded this information in the canvas before the painting began. But who? And why hide banking information in a portrait that was supposed to be a private family artwork? Omar returned from his call to find Kwame standing, motionless before the easel, palette knife still in hand, paint scattered across the floor where his shock had caused him to drop his materials. "What's wrong?" Omar asked, then saw the exposed inscription. His face went pale. "Where did that come from?" "I was hoping you could tell me. It's written directly on the canvas, underneath the paint layers. Someone put it there before we started working." Omar moved closer, studying the revealed text with an expression that cycled rapidly through confusion, recognition, and something that looked like fear. "Youssef," he said quietly. "This is Youssef's handwriting. Your security man? The one who's been watching me? He's more than security. He's been my confessor, I suppose you could say. The only person who knows all of Rashid al-Zahrani's secrets." Kwame felt a chill run down his spine. All of them? Everything. The original identity theft, the ongoing payments to Kofi's family, the business practices that weren't entirely legal. In the early years, the medical diagnosis I've been hiding from my children. And he put this information in our portrait without telling us. Why? Omar sank into the nearest chair, suddenly looking older than his 45 years. "Because Youssef doesn't trust my judgment about what should happen to certain information. When I die, what kind of information? The kind that could destroy lives if it fell into the wrong hands, or save them if it reached the right people at the right time." Omar pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Youssef, come to the salon immediately and bring the file we discussed last month." 20 minutes later, Youssef arrived carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived several decades of careful use. He was a man in his 60s, Kwame realized, though his alert posture and quick movements suggested someone much younger. His eyes held the particular sharpness of someone who had learned to notice details that others missed. "You found it," Youssef said, looking at the exposed inscription without surprise. "You expected us to find it," Omar replied. "This wasn't an accident. No, it wasn't. You've been talking about honesty, about leaving truth behind for the people you love, but you haven't been honest about the most important part." Youssef opened the briefcase and withdrew a thick folder labeled with the same file number that had been hidden in the painting. "This contains documentation of every illegal or questionable activity associated with building Rashid al-Zahrani's empire, early tax evasion, bribery of officials in 3 countries, partnerships with individuals whose business practices were ethically flexible." Kwame felt the world tilt again. Omar, what is he talking about? "The things I did to survive. In the early years weren't all noble. When you're building a false identity in a part of the world where everything runs on connections and cash, you sometimes partner with people who don't ask questions because they don't want to answer any themselves." "What kind of people?" Youssef answered instead of Omar, arms dealers who needed to launder money through legitimate businesses, politicians who required silent partners in construction projects that were funded with embezzled public funds, businessmen who shipped goods through routes that avoided certain regulatory oversights. The revelation hit Kwame like a physical blow. It was one thing to learn that his brother had killed someone in self-defense and stolen money to escape. It was entirely different to discover that the subsequent 30 years of success had been built through systematic criminal activity. "I thought you said you made your fortune through legitimate business," Kwame said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I said I started with trade between Morocco and the Gulf states, finding inefficiencies in supply chains. I didn't specify what kind of goods I was trading or what made those supply chains inefficient. But the charitable work, the scholarships, the medical care for orphans, all real," Youssef interjected, "and all funded with money that was cleaned through increasingly legitimate enterprises. Mr. Al-Zarani has been what you might call a reformed criminal for the past 15 years. But the foundation of his wealth remains problematic." Omar stood and walked to the window, his reflection in the glass, showing a man who looked fragmented, caught between multiple versions of himself. "This is why I can't simply reveal the truth about Omar Asante," he said. "It's not just about a false identity anymore. It's about a business empire that could be seized by governments in multiple countries if they discovered that its original capital came from criminal enterprises." "How much money are we talking about?" Kwame asked. "The legitimate businesses are worth approximately 400 million, as I told you. But if authorities in Morocco, Saudi Arabia and Nigeria decided to investigate the original funding sources, they could potentially claim everything. Every scholarship would be cancelled, every medical program shut down, every legitimate employee left without work." Kwame stared at the portrait they had been creating together. Two brothers who had found each other again, painted with loving attention to the possibility of redemption and forgiveness. Now it felt like a lie, as elaborate as any Omar had constructed. "So this portrait," Kwame said slowly, "is actually evidence of crimes that could destroy thousands of people's lives." "Not the portrait itself," Youssef corrected, "but the information I embedded in it leads to documentation that could be used, either to prosecute those crimes or to ensure that the charitable work continues regardless of what happens to Mr. Al-Zarani's legal status." "I don't understand." Youssef opened the folder and showed Kwame a series of legal documents. "These are trust arrangements, established over the past 5 years, that legally separate the charitable foundations from the business empire. If Mr. Al-Zarani dies or is prosecuted, the foundations become independent entities with their own funding sources. Funding sources that can't be traced back to the original criminal activity?" "Correct. But only if certain procedures are followed, certain documents are filed, and certain people are notified at the right times." Omar turned back toward them. "Youssef has been preparing for the possibility that I might not live long enough to complete these arrangements personally, because of the cancer. Because of the cancer, yes, but also because there are people who have been investigating Rashid Al-Zarani's background for the past 2 years. Not law enforcement, business competitors who suspect that his success came from advantages they didn't have access to." Kwame felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. What had begun as a simple portrait commission had evolved into a family reunion, then into a deathbed confession, and now into something that resembled industrial espionage. "Why hide this information in our portrait specifically?" he asked Youssef. "Because a painting can travel across borders without declaring its contents. Because it's the kind of personal item that families keep for generations without official scrutiny. And because if something happened to both Mr. Al-Zarani and myself, you would be the person most likely to preserve it and eventually to understand its significance. You're making me complicit in your cover-up." I'm making you the guardian of information that could either destroy or preserve the life's work of the brother you thought you'd lost forever. The weight of that responsibility settled over Kwame like a shroud. He looked at the portrait, their portrait, and realized that it had become something far more complex than either of them had intended. It was simultaneously a work of art, a family memoir, a legal document, and a potential weapon. "What happens if I refuse this responsibility?" Omar answered. "Then when I die, everything dies with me." The truth about Omar Asante, the legitimate charitable work funded by illegitimate money, and any possibility that the people who have been helped by Rashid al-Zahrani's foundations will continue to receive that help. And if I accept it, then you become the keeper of secrets that could send your brother to prison in multiple countries, but you also become the person who can ensure that something good survives from everything he's built. Kwame studied the faces in the portrait, his own and his brother's, painted with such care and attention to emotional truth. They looked like men who had found peace with each other and with their shared past. But underneath the paint, literally embedded in the fabric of their reconciliation, lay information that could transform love into liability. "I need time to think about this," Kwame said. "Of course," Omar replied, "but not too much time. The portrait needs to be finished, and these arrangements need to be completed while I'm still healthy enough to travel and sign documents." As Youssef packed away the legal documents and prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Mr. Asante," he said to Kwame, "your brother is not the same man who fled Ghana 30 years ago. He is also not entirely the man he has pretended to be since then. But he is the only person I have ever worked for who insisted on giving away more money than he kept for himself. That should count for something in your decision." After Youssef left, the brothers sat in silence, the portrait between them like a bridge that had become more complicated to cross than either had anticipated. "I'm sorry," Omar said finally. "I thought I was giving you back your brother. I didn't realize I was also giving you all of his burdens." Kwame looked at the inscription they had uncovered, then at the faces they had painted with such hope for honesty and redemption. "Maybe that's what family really means," he said. "Not just sharing the good parts, but carrying the weight of everything together." Outside the salon windows, the afternoon light was beginning its familiar progression toward evening, casting longer shadows that would soon require artificial illumination to continue their work. But for the first time since beginning the portrait, neither brother was sure whether they wanted to finish what they had started. 3 days after the revelation about the hidden inscription, Kwame made his decision. He arrived at the hotel salon, carrying not just his usual painting supplies, but also a letter he had written and rewritten throughout a sleepless night. Omar was already there, standing before the portrait with an expression that suggested he had been wrestling with his own impossible choices. "I've decided," Kwame said without preamble, setting down his materials and withdrawing the letter from his jacket pocket. Omar turned, his face showing a mixture of hope and resignation. "And? I'll help you finish this. All of it. The portrait, the legal arrangements, the transition of the charitable foundations, but on 3 conditions. Name them." Kwame unfolded the letter, though he had memorized its contents. "First, I want a complete accounting of every person who has been harmed by your business practices, and a plan for making direct restitution to them or their families. That could take months to compile. Then we work faster. You said yourself that you have 6 to 8 months. We use part of that time to ensure that your redemption isn't just about the people you helped, but also about the people you hurt." Omar nodded slowly. "Second condition. Your children deserve to know who their father really is. Not everything, not the details that could endanger them, but enough truth that they can make informed decisions about the legacy they're inheriting. They're not ready for that kind of burden. You don't get to decide that for them. People are stronger than we think, especially when they're given the chance to rise to meet difficult truths. Omar walked to the window, gazing out at the mountains that had witnessed so many of their conversations. When he turned back, his expression had changed, less defensive, more accepting. Third condition: I want to document this entire process. Not just the portrait, but everything. Your story, the restitution efforts, the conversations with your children, the transition of the foundations. I want to create a complete record of what it looks like when someone tries to die honestly after living dishonestly. For what purpose? Because your story isn't just about you. There are other people struggling with the weight of their choices, other families separated by secrets, other individuals who have built their lives on foundations they're not proud of. Your attempt at redemption could be a roadmap for others. Omar was quiet for a long time, his gaze moving between the portrait and his brother's determined face. You're asking me to turn my personal confession into a public teaching moment. I'm asking you to make your suffering useful to other people. Isn't that what art is supposed to do? And if this documentation puts other people at risk, Youssef, for instance, or business partners who trusted Rashid al-Zahrani's discretion, then we change names, alter details, protect the innocent while preserving the essential truth. I'm an artist, Omar. I know how to tell stories that capture reality without compromising the people living within that reality. Kwame moved to the easel and began mixing the colors he would need to complete the final details of the portrait. But the choice is yours. We can finish this painting as a private family artifact and handle your legal affairs quietly, or we can treat this entire experience as something that might help other people navigate similar, impossible situations. Omar joined him at the easel, settling back into the pose they had refined over weeks of work. But his expression was different, now more resolved, more at peace with complexity. Tell me about the people you want to help with this documentation. Immigrants who have had to reinvent themselves to survive. Business people who compromise their ethics early in their careers and don't know how to make amends. Families divided by secrets that feel too dangerous to reveal. Anyone who has ever felt trapped between the person they were and the person they became. As Kwame worked on the subtle play of light across their faces, Omar began to speak, not about business or logistics, but about the emotional weight of carrying multiple identities for 3 decades. The hardest part, Omar said, wasn't the lying itself. It was the isolation. Rashid al-Zahrani had colleagues, business partners, social acquaintances, but he never had friends. Real friends require the kind of vulnerability that would have exposed everything. What about Layla? Layla was different. I could be emotionally honest with her even when I couldn't be factually honest. She knew when I was sad, when I was proud, when I was worried about business or excited about family. She just didn't know why I felt those things as deeply as I did. Kwame added a subtle highlight to Omar's eyes, capturing the particular quality of light that appeared when he talked about his wife. Do you think she would have accepted the truth? I think she already had accepted it, without knowing exactly what she was accepting. The last conversation we had before she went into the hospital, she told me that she had fallen in love with the mystery of me, not just the facts. She said that whoever I had been before I became her husband, she was grateful for the journey that had brought me to her. That sounds like permission. It sounds like grace. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of brush against canvas, creating a meditation on the possibility of redemption. The portrait was nearly complete. 2 men who shared a genetic heritage and a complicated love, painted with enough technical skill to capture their individual characters, and enough emotional depth to suggest the weight of their shared history. There's something I need to tell you about the gallery fire, Kwame said, as he began work on the final details of his own face in the painting. Omar looked up. What about it? It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't arson by strangers. I caused it. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Omar's pose didn't change, but his entire body tensed. How? I had been experimenting with a new medium, oils mixed with a resin compound that was supposed to create unusual texture effects. I didn't realize how flammable the mixture was until I left a canvas drying too close to a space heater. The fire started in my studio and spread to the gallery before I could stop it. But you were cleared by the investigation, because I never told them about the experimental medium. I was afraid that admitting to causing the fire would ruin any chance of insurance compensation, so I let them believe it was electrical failure. Omar stared at his brother with an expression that cycled through surprise, understanding, and something that might have been relief. So you've been carrying guilt about destroying your own career. I've been carrying guilt about letting other people believe I might be a criminal when I knew exactly what had caused the fire. Why tell me this now? Because if we're going to document a story about honesty and redemption, it should be complete. My life hasn't been as innocent as I've been letting you believe. Omar began to laugh, not with humor, but with the exhausted relief of someone who had been holding his breath for years. So neither of us is the person the other remembered. No, but maybe that's better. Maybe love between real people is stronger than love between idealized memories. As the afternoon light reached its optimal angle, Kwame made the final brush strokes. On the portrait, the faces that looked back from the canvas were recognizably those of two brothers, but they were also the faces of two men who had learned to carry the weight of their choices without being crushed by them. It's finished, Kwame said, stepping back to assess the completed work. Omar rose from his pose and joined him in front of the easel. The portrait showed two men seated at slight angles to each other, their faces turned toward the viewer with expressions that were both individual and harmonious. Omar's face carried the dignity of someone who had built something significant from difficult circumstances, while also showing the vulnerability of someone ready to be known completely. Kwame's face reflected the particular strength of someone who had survived professional destruction and found himself capable of rebuilding not just his career, but his capacity for trust. But it was the space between them that made the portrait extraordinary. The suggestion of conversation, shared understanding, and mutual acceptance that spoke to something larger than individual character. What happens now? Omar asked. Now we sign it. Kwame picked up a fine brush and moved to the lower right corner of the canvas. In careful letters he wrote, Kwame Asante, artist. Then he handed the brush to Omar. Omar studied the blank space beside his brother's signature, understanding that what he wrote there would determine how the portrait and its hidden secrets would be understood by anyone who saw it in the future. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote, Omar Asante, brother. The signature was small, nearly invisible unless someone looked closely. But it was there, the first time in 30 years that Omar Asante's name had appeared on any official document. Your children will ask about that signature eventually, Kwame said. Yes, they will, and when they do, I'll tell them about their uncle who painted their father's portrait, and about the brother their father thought he had lost forever. And if they ask why your brother shares your original name, I'll tell them that some stories are complicated enough to require a lifetime of understanding. 3 months later, Kwame received a phone call at his new studio in Casablanca, a space rented with money from the completed commission, equipped with proper lighting and enough room to work on large canvases. The caller identified herself as Amira al-Zahrani, Omar's eldest daughter. My father wanted me to call you, she said in accented but perfect English. He wanted you to know that the arrangements Youssef prepared have been completed successfully. The foundations are secure, the restitution payments have been initiated, and the documentation you requested has been compiled. How is he? Peaceful. He's been working with a writer to complete the record you discussed. He said to tell you that dying honestly is harder than living dishonestly, but it's also the only way he's ever felt truly free. After ending the call, Kwame returned to his easel, where he was working on a new series, portraits of immigrants and refugees in Morocco, people who had reinvented themselves out of necessity and were learning to build new lives on foundations of chosen truth rather than inherited circumstance. The dual portrait of the Asante brothers hung on the studio wall, a reminder that love could survive the complete absence of illusion, that redemption was possible even for people who had made irreversible choices, and that sometimes the most important art happened not in museums or galleries, but in the quiet spaces where people learned to see each other clearly. 6 weeks later, Omar Asante died quietly in his sleep, surrounded by family who had learned to love the complicated truth of who their father had been. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people who knew him as Rashid al-Zahrani, but his headstone bore both names, a final act of integration between the man he had been born as and the man he had chosen to become. The portrait remained in Kwame's studio for another year before he felt ready to part with it. When he finally did, it went not to a gallery or museum, but to a wall in the offices of the Al-Zahrani Foundation, where it served as a daily reminder that the most powerful transformations happen not when people reinvent themselves completely, but when they find the courage to integrate all the pieces of who they have been into a coherent vision of who they choose to become. And in the lower right corner, almost invisible unless someone looked closely, 2 signatures testified to the possibility that even the most complicated truths could become the foundation for the simplest and most essential human connection. The love between brothers who had learned to see each other exactly as they were. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.